The Hindu Kush mountains have a way of making even the most hardened soldiers feel small. I should know. I've spent enough nights perched on their razor-sharp ridges, watching the valleys below through various pieces of military hardware. But nothing could have prepared me for what I witnessed that night in Kunar province. Our team had established an overwatch position on a particularly nasty piece of real estate, a ridge overlooking a suspected IED manufacturing hub. The village below seemed peaceful enough, but we'd learned the hard way that appearances in Afghanistan were often deceiving. The air was thin up there, and the cold had a way of seeping through even our best cold weather gear. The stars above were impossibly bright, like someone had scattered diamonds across black velvet. I was familiarizing myself with our newest piece of kit, the Recon 3 thermal imaging system. It was a beautiful piece of technology, leagues ahead of our older equipment. The clarity was almost unsettling. You could make out individual heat signatures from goats wandering between compounds nearly a kilometer away. My team was passing the time with the usual chatter, stories about home, complaints about the MREs, plans for leave. But I was absorbed in learning every function of the Recon 3. Something about its precision felt reassuring in this ancient, unpredictable landscape. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a cluster of heat signatures gathered around what might have been a fire high up on a false peak to our northeast. Nothing unusual there. We'd seen plenty of gatherings in these mountains, usually insurgents planning their next move. But as I adjusted the focus, trying to get a better count of the figures, something impossible happened. The cluster of signatures began to merge, coalescing into a single, massive form. My hands were steady. Years of training had ensured that, but my mind was racing. The figure stood, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The trees around it, which I knew from our terrain analysis to be about 12 feet tall, barely reached its waist. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing: equipment malfunction, atmospheric distortion, sleep deprivation. But the Recon 3's calibration was perfect, and I hadn't been awake long enough to be hallucinating. Then it moved. The motion was fluid, almost graceful, completely at odds with its massive size. It covered the distance between two ridge lines, easily several hundred meters, in what seemed like a handful of strides. The movement reminded me of time-lapse footage I'd seen of clouds rolling over mountains, except this was happening in real time, right in front of me. Before I could alert anyone else, the figure disappeared behind another ridge, leaving me alone with the knowledge of what I'd seen. I kept silent. What could I say? That I'd seen something impossible through a piece of military equipment that cost more than my yearly salary? That there was something in these mountains that defied explanation? I'd seen the way other soldiers were treated when they reported strange experiences, so I said nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something in these ancient mountains had noticed us, and we were the ones being watched. Dawn in the Hindu Kush comes gradually, like a dimmer switch being turned up by a hesitant hand. As the first rays of sunlight painted the mountaintops in shades of pale gold, our team began breaking down our observation post, each of us moving with the practiced efficiency that comes from months of repeated operations. But something felt different that morning. There was a heaviness in the air that had nothing to do with the altitude. The mountains loomed around us, ancient and indifferent, their peaks disappearing into the low-hanging clouds. As we made our way down toward the village for our scheduled community engagement, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. Not the usual sensation of hidden eyes that every soldier develops in a combat zone. This was different, more primal, like being stalked by something that didn't quite belong in the natural order of things. The villagers' behavior only amplified my unease. In my experience, Afghan civilians generally fell into two categories: those who welcomed our presence and those who barely tolerated it. But that morning, they were different, almost ghost-like in their movements, keeping their distance, their eyes fixed firmly on the ground or the middle distance. Even the children, usually quick to crowd around us asking for candy or pens, remained hidden behind doorways and walls. I approached one of the village elders, a man I'd spoken with several times before. His face was a topographical map of wrinkles, each line seeming to hold some ancient secret. Through my interpreter, I asked about the orange-dyed goats I'd noticed in their pens, an unusual sight that stood out against the muted browns and grays of the village. The elder's reaction was immediate and unsettling. His weathered features tightened, and he muttered something that made our interpreter shift uncomfortably. "Diva e Kunar," the old man said, one of the few phrases he spoke directly to me, before turning away with a speed that belied his age. When I pressed our interpreter for a translation, he merely shook his head, his usual eagerness to help notably absent. Later that morning, we intercepted Taliban radio chatter that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Our signal specialist translated fragments of conversations about an unseen enemy in the mountains. The insurgents, hardened fighters who usually discussed their operations with cold efficiency, sounded agitated, almost frightened. They spoke of missing men, of paths that could no longer be used, of areas in the mountains that had become forbidden even to their most experienced fighters. I found myself standing at the edge of the village, staring up at the ridgeline where I'd seen that impossible figure through the Recon 3. The morning sun had burned away most of the shadows, but somehow the mountains seemed darker, more foreboding. The rational part of my mind, the part that had carried me through firefights and IED attacks, tried to impose order on the chaos of my thoughts. But another part, perhaps the same instinct that had kept our ancestors alive in the days before electric lights and thermal imagers, whispered that we were dealing with something our modern military training hadn't prepared us for. Our next patrol took us along the village's eastern perimeter, just as the sun was beginning to set. The timing, as it turned out, couldn't have been more significant. The first sign that something unusual was happening came from the smell, a peculiar mixture of burning herbs, and what I later learned was madder root, used traditionally for dyeing cloth and apparently goats. We found the villagers gathered in a clearing just outside the main settlement. The scene before us was like something from a documentary about ancient religions, except this was happening in real time, with the evening patrol report still warm in my pocket. A large bonfire dominated the center of the clearing, its flames casting long shadows that danced against the mountain walls. Around it, several village men were leading goats in a circular pattern, while others applied a vibrant orange dye to their wool. The chanting started low, almost subsonic, more felt than heard. The words were in Pashto, but this wasn't the call to prayer we'd grown accustomed to hearing 5 times a day. This was older, more rhythmic, a sound that seemed to resonate with the stones themselves. I activated my handheld camera, knowing that whatever this was, it needed to be documented. The ritual unfolded with a precision that spoke of countless repetitions. As the dye was applied, the chanting grew louder, more urgent. The goats, surprisingly calm, despite the chaos around them, were adorned with small mirrors and bells that caught the firelight and created an otherworldly atmosphere. The entire scene felt suspended between centuries, modern military equipment and ancient ritual existing in the same space, but somehow occupying different times. When the ceremony reached its climax, the dyed goats were gathered together and led toward a narrow mountain path. The villagers followed partway, their chanting fading to whispers before stopping altogether. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant tinkling of the goat's bells as they disappeared into the gathering darkness. That's when it happened, a moment I'll never forget. A young boy, perhaps 7 or 8, broke away from the dispersing crowd and approached me. His eyes were wide, not with the usual curiosity we saw in local children, but with an urgency that made him seem much older. In broken English, he whispered, "The giant takes them." Peace offering. Before I could respond, his father appeared, roughly grabbing his arm and pulling him away, fear evident in every line of his body. I spent that night on guard duty, watching the mountain path where the goats had disappeared. The bells had long since fallen silent, and the village was still. Around midnight, I heard it, a sound like distant thunder, except the sky was clear and star-filled. Through my night vision goggles, I could see that the goats were gone, leaving only scattered mirrors that reflected the starlight like eyes in the darkness. The night of the encounter started like any other operation: equipment checks, radio tests, final briefing. Our mission was simple: monitor suspected insurgent movement near the site of the ritual we'd witnessed. Intel suggested the Taliban were using ancient shepherd paths for weapons transportation. Looking back, I wonder if they knew something we didn't about why those paths had been abandoned. The moon hung low and full, casting sharp shadows across the mountainside. We moved in a standard patrol formation, our boots crunching softly on the rocky ground. The Recon 3 felt heavy against my chest, its familiar weight somehow reassuring. The air temperature had dropped significantly, and our breath came out in visible puffs that disappeared quickly in the thin mountain air. Around 0200 hours, I began my regular thermal sweep of the ridgeline. The screen showed the usual cold landscape, with occasional heat signatures from small animals. Then something changed. At first, I thought the equipment was malfunctioning. The heat signature that appeared was unlike anything I'd seen before. It moved with purpose down the ridge, its size making a mockery of our scaled reference points. "Contact, bearing 030, I whispered into my radio, my training taking over despite the impossibility of what I was seeing. The team responded immediately, taking covered positions among the rocks. Through the Recon 3, I watched the figure's methodical descent. Its movement pattern defied everything I knew about human locomotion. Too fluid, too efficient for the treacherous terrain. The figure paused about 200 meters from our position. Even without the thermal imaging, we could see it now. A massive silhouette against the starlit sky. The moonlight caught its hair, revealing a color that matched the dyed goats from the ritual. Its eyes. God help me. Its eyes glowed like embers in a dying fire, casting their own light in the darkness. Time seemed to stop. None of us moved. None of us breathed. The giant stood motionless, its head turned in our direction. The rational part of my mind tried to calculate its height using known reference points. At least 20 feet, possibly more. My hands were steady on the Recon 3, but my heart hammered against my ribs so hard I was sure it must be visible on thermal imaging. Then it happened. The giant took one step forward, a movement that covered more ground than a running man could in 3 strides. The sound of multiple safeties clicking off broke the silence. Before anyone could squeeze a trigger, the giant turned with impossible grace and simply vanished. One moment it was there, a mountain moving among mountains, and the next it was gone, leaving only the after image burned into our retinas and our thermal screens. The radio crackled. What the fuck was that? Someone whispered, their voice shaking. No one answered. What could we say? How do you report seeing something that shouldn't exist? The lieutenant finally broke the silence, ordering us to continue our patrol. But we all knew something had fundamentally changed. We weren't just fighting insurgents anymore. We were in the domain of something far older, far more dangerous than any human enemy. The morning after the encounter, we returned to the area under the pretense of conducting a standard reconnaissance sweep. The sun was barely over the horizon, and frost still covered the ground, creating a crystalline landscape that crunched under our boots. That's when we found them, the footprints. They were pressed deep into the frozen earth, each one large enough for a man to lie down in. The spacing between them matched the giant's impossible stride we'd witnessed the night before. I knelt beside one print, my hand hovering over its surface. Despite the freezing temperature, warmth radiated from the impression, as if whatever made it carried the heat of the Earth's core. While documenting the prints, Rodriguez called out from a nearby outcropping. We found him standing over scattered artifacts partially exposed by recent erosion. Ancient coins lay scattered among fragments of pottery, their surfaces covered in script none of us recognized. Each coin felt unnaturally warm to the touch, like they retained the heat of the forge that created them centuries ago. I picked up one of the coins, studying its worn surface. The metal was like nothing I'd ever seen. Not quite gold, not quite copper, with strange symbols that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Without really thinking about it, I slipped it into my pocket. The weight of it felt significant, like I was pocketing a piece of history that was never meant to be found. Our lieutenant arrived, took one look at the scene, and his face hardened. "Natural rock formations," he said about the footprints, his voice tight with forced skepticism. "And some old trader's lost cargo." The look in his eyes dared any of us to contradict him. I understood his position. How do you write a report about something like this without ending your career? But standing there, feeling the alien warmth of the coin in my pocket, I knew we were all pretending. Pretending we hadn't seen what we saw. Pretending these weren't the footprints of something that shouldn't exist. Pretending we were still operating in a world that made sense. The coin seemed to pulse gently against my leg as we made our way back to base, like a tiny heartbeat marking time in a pocket universe where giants still walked the earth. The coin in my pocket had become a constant reminder, its supernatural warmth burning questions into my mind that demanded answers. After our discovery of the footprints and artifacts, I couldn't leave well enough alone. I had to know more. I found the village elder sitting in his usual place, a small courtyard where the morning sun painted patterns through a grape arbor. His eyes fixed on me as I approached, and for the first time, I noticed their color, an unusual amber that seemed to hold the same ancient light as the mountains themselves. My interpreter hung back, reluctant, but finally moved forward when I insisted. "Tell me about the Diva Kunar," I said, my voice steady despite the weight of the coin seeming to grow heavier in my pocket. The elder's face transformed. Fear, reverence, and something else, something deeper, played across his weathered features. For a long moment, he was silent. Then, as if coming to a decision, he began to speak. My interpreter translated, his voice growing more uncertain with each word. "It has always been here, before the Russians, before the British, before Alexander. It is neither good nor evil, as the mountain is neither good nor evil. But like the mountain, it demands respect." The elder's voice took on a rhythmic quality, as if reciting something passed down through generations. When our ancestors first came to these valleys, they fought the Diva. Many died. Until one wise woman learned that it did not want our land. It wanted recognition, acknowledgement. The offerings began, and peace followed. He leaned forward, his amber eyes suddenly intense. "But you Americans, you come with your machines, your weapons, your arrogance. You do not offer respect. You do not acknowledge the ancient ones. And now it watches, grows angry." The interpreter hesitated on the next part, but the elder's glare compelled him to continue. "The Diva does not care for our wars. Taliban, American, these mean nothing to one who has watched empires rise and fall like seasons. But it protects its domain. The offerings, the goats, the dyed wool. These are our part of an ancient covenant. When outsiders break this covenant..." His voice trailed off, and he made a gesture I'd never seen before, touching his forehead, heart, and then pointing to the mountains. "Do not go into its territory again," he whispered. "Some places are not meant for men with guns." The coin burned against my leg, and the elder's eyes flickered to my pocket. A knowing look crossed his face. "You carry a piece of its history," he said. "It will know. It always knows." 2 days after the elder's warning, we received intel about a major weapons cache hidden high in the mountains. The location put it squarely in what I had come to think of as the Giant's territory, but orders were orders. As we geared up for the mission, I felt the coin pulse with increasing warmth, like a warning beacon against my thigh. We moved out before dawn, a full squad plus attached elements. The approach took us through narrow valleys and along ancient paths that showed no signs of recent use. No Taliban tracks, no shepherd marks, nothing. Just smooth stone and an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow our footsteps. The first tremor hit as we approached the target coordinates. Subtle at first, like distant artillery, but no guns were firing that morning. I felt the coin grow hot enough to burn, even through my pocket lining. The second tremor nearly took us off our feet. Then we saw it. It rose from behind a ridge like a mountain coming to life. In the gray pre-dawn light, its true scale became apparent. The thermal images hadn't done it justice. Its hair blazed like copper wire in the sun, its skin the color of weathered stone. Those eyes, those terrible ancient eyes, fixed upon us with an intelligence that felt older than humanity itself. Someone opened fire. The sound of automatic weapons shattered the mountain silence, but the bullets might as well have been raindrops for all the effect they had. The giant moved, and the very air seemed to distort around it. A massive hand swept across our position, sending men and equipment flying like leaves in a storm. I found myself separated from the others, pressed against a rock face, the coin now burning with unbearable heat. The giant's attention turned to me, and in that moment, I understood what the elder meant about recognition. I pulled the coin from my pocket. It was glowing like a hot coal, and held it out. Time seemed to stop. The giant's eyes focused on the coin, then met mine. In that gaze, I saw eons pass like seconds. Without thinking, I dropped to my knees and placed the coin on a flat rock before me. The gesture felt right, felt ancient. The giant's expression shifted, something almost like approval crossing its primordial features. It reached down, and for a moment, I thought death had finally come. Instead, one massive finger touched the coin, and the burning heat subsided. When I looked up again, the giant was gone, taking the coin with it. The weapons cache, when we finally found it, remained untouched. They evacuated me with a concussion and 3 broken ribs, injuries from being caught in an unexpected rock slide, according to the official report. In the hospital at Bagram, I started writing everything down in a journal, knowing that the truth would sound like madness to anyone who hadn't been there. The others who survived talked about a freak geological event, a perfectly natural explanation for what happened. I watched them rationalize it, reshape their memories into something that wouldn't shatter their worldview. Maybe that was healthier. Maybe that was saner. Years later, back home in Montana, I heard a late-night radio show discussing the Giant of Kandahar, another soldier's encounter with something impossible in those ancient mountains. I sat in my truck, listening to the familiar pattern of disbelief and rationalization from the host, and felt the phantom warmth of that coin against my leg. Sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howls around my house, I take out my old journal and read through those entries. The giant's eyes still burn in my memory, ancient and knowing. I think about the elder's words, about accepting that some places have guardians older than our civilizations, older than our wars, I've never told this story under my own name. Let others debate whether it was mass hallucination, stress, or thin mountain air. I know what I saw. I know what's out there, watching from peaks too high for helicopters, from valleys too deep for drones. And sometimes, when I see pictures of those mountains on the news, I look for a flash of copper-red hair against the stone, for eyes that glow like embers in the dark. The war in Afghanistan is over now, but the diva Kunar remains, as it has for thousands of years. Sometimes I wonder if the villagers still make their offerings, still dye the goat's wool orange, still maintain that ancient covenant. And sometimes in my dreams, I feel the weight of that coin in my pocket, warm and alive, calling me back to the place where myths and modern warfare collided, where I learned that some legends don't die. They just wait in the high places of the world, watching and remembering.